Chapter 1. The Summer Garden Fete. The village of Marlecombe was never more charming than in early summer, when the hedgerows grew thick with wild roses and the lawns were clipped to perfection. On this particular June afternoon, the vicarage garden was in its full glory, with striped tents set up for cakes, jams, and bric-a-brac, while children darted about with shrill laughter, tugging their parents toward the raffles and stalls. It was the annual garden fete, the highlight of the season, and nearly every soul in Marlecombe had turned out to take part. Beneath the spreading chestnut tree, Mrs. Bartlett was presiding over the sponge cake competition with her usual severity, while the Reverend Pritchard attempted, somewhat hopelessly, to keep order near the coconut shy. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in pale grey with a small straw hat perched neatly upon her head, had taken a modest seat near the tea tent. She was listening, as she so often did, to the easy flow of conversation around her. She had long since discovered that gossip, if one only attended to it closely, could be as revealing as any official inquiry. "Did you hear about Mrs. Denham?" murmured Mrs. Bartlett to her neighbour in a stage whisper. "All that business with her late husband's will, it's bound to end in trouble, you mark my words." "Trouble has a way of finding people in this village," replied her neighbour. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People were so very alike everywhere, St. Mary Mead or Marlecombe, it made little difference. Beneath polite exteriors, there were always grudges, jealousies, little secrets carefully tucked away. The fete was in full swing when the first note of discord slipped into the day. It was nothing, at first, more than a ripple of disturbance near the garden maze at the edge of the grounds. The maze was an old feature of Marlecombe Manor, its yew hedges tall and neatly trimmed, forming twisting paths that children loved to run through. Someone had thought it diverting to open the gates to the public for the fete. But now, a cry, sharp, unmistakable, rose from within the maze. Heads turned. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if drawn by curiosity, people began drifting toward the entrance. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded over her bag. She had heard many such cries in her lifetime, and she knew the timbre of genuine alarm when she heard it. Slowly, she rose and followed the others. By the time she reached the maze, a small crowd had gathered. Reverend Pritchard was pushing his way in, his face pale. A moment later, he stumbled back out, his expression stricken. There's been an accident," he stammered. But even as he spoke, Miss Marple saw the truth written plainly on his face. In her quiet, steady way, she knew what the villagers did not yet fully comprehend. This was no accident. The peace of Marlecombe had been broken. And somewhere within those green hedges lay the beginning of a dark mystery. Chapter 2. The Body in the Maze. The hedges of the Marlecombe maze, neat and symmetrical in the afternoon sun, now seemed to close in with a quiet menace. The villagers, who had approached with curiosity, now hesitated at the entrance, reluctant to step further. It was one thing to gossip about scandals. It was quite another to be confronted with something dark and real. Inside, the Reverend Pritchard stood, his hands trembling as he wiped his spectacles. We must call the constable at once," he said faintly. Two men from the village, sturdy farmers both, had already ventured into the maze and returned with grim faces. Behind them, whispers spread quickly. "It's Mr. Denham, Henry Denham." "Surely not, oh, surely not." "How dreadful. Right here at the fete." Miss Marple, arriving quietly at the edge, allowed herself to be guided with the crowd a little closer. She did not press forward, nor exclaim with the others. She merely observed. Through a gap in the hedges, she glimpsed the body, a man in his late 50s, well dressed in a dark summer suit, lying awkwardly on the gravel path. One hand was flung out as though in protest, the other pressed against his chest. His face was pale, almost waxen, and around him the yew hedges stood as silent sentinels. "Heart failure, most likely," said Dr. Harrison, the village physician, who had been fetched in haste. He bent over the body with professional briskness, yet there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Though, he stopped, glancing about as though reluctant to continue in front of so many eager listeners. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the path. Not 6 feet from the body lay a crushed paper cup, the sort used at the lemonade stall. A small thing, easily overlooked, yet her mind stored it away with precision. The constable, young Inspector Graves, soon arrived, perspiring and slightly breathless. He was new to the district and carried himself with the seriousness of one who wished very much to prove himself. "Stand back, all of you," he ordered firmly, though his voice wavered a little. "This is a matter for the police now." Questions flew at once. Was it murder? Did he fall? Who found him first? The inspector tried to quiet them, but the village hum of speculation had already begun. It was like a hive disturbed. Every whisper carried further, every suspicion sharpened. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. She knew well enough that in every tragedy lay layers beneath the surface. Henry Denham was not a man universally liked. His dealings had made enemies, and his manner was often brusque. Still, she thought, a garden fete was an odd setting for a man to meet his end. As the body was covered and removed, the villagers drifted back toward the tea tent, where gossip swelled louder than before. Cups clinked, cakes were half eaten, but all conversation circled back to the maze, to the sudden death of Henry Denham. Miss Marple, seated once more with her teacup, listened as fragments of speculation reached her ears. Poison, jealousy, debts, the will. Already the theories multiplied. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes thoughtful. It was not in her nature to leap to conclusions, but something, some small detail, troubled her deeply. And though no one else yet saw it, she knew with a quiet certainty, this was not the end of the matter. This was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Whispers in Marlecombe. By evening, the fete had dwindled into a hushed confusion. The bunting still fluttered in the breeze, but the gaiety had drained away, leaving only small knots of villagers speaking in lowered tones. The raffle prizes lay uncollected, the coconut shy deserted. The shadow of the maze seemed to stretch across the entire green. News in a village travels faster than any newspaper, and by the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage for a cup of tea, the whole of Marlecombe was already alive with speculation. It was poison, you mark my words, declared Mrs. Bartlett, who had followed Miss Marple into the vicarage kitchen. A man doesn't simply keel over like that at a fete. Not unless something, or someone, helped him on his way. Mrs. Pritchard, bustling with cups and saucers, added gravely, he was never a popular man. Poor Mrs. Denham must be beside herself. Though, between ourselves, she's better off without him. A most overbearing husband. Miss Marple did not contradict either woman. She merely nodded, her pale eyes reflecting mild interest. She knew well enough that gossip was like smoke, it revealed the direction of the fire, but never its precise source. The name of Henry Denham had always stirred mixed feelings in Marlecombe. He was a man of some means, with land, investments, and a manner that suggested he believed himself above most of his neighbours. Yet his dealings had left bruises, a farmer ruined by a sharp contract, a maid dismissed under cruel circumstances, a niece denied her inheritance. Small grievances, perhaps, but in the quiet soil of an English village, such grievances had a way of growing roots. That night, the constable made his rounds, questioning those who had been nearest the maze when the cry went up. Some spoke readily, some with hesitation. Young Inspector Graves listened intently, but his questions had the blunt edge of inexperience. Did you see anyone near Mr. Denham before he fell? Was he alone? Had he taken anything, food, drink, at the fete? To most, the answers were vague. A glimpse here, a murmur there. Yes, he had been seen near the lemonade stall. Yes, he had spoken sharply to Mrs. Denham only an hour before. Yes, he had carried a small notebook in his pocket. But nothing clear, nothing decisive. Miss Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the vicarage drawing-room, listened to the comings and goings. She knitted slowly, her needles clicking with soft regularity. The young inspector glanced at her once or twice, as though uncertain whether the elderly spinster should be sent to bed. But something in her calm, untroubled face held him back. For Miss Marple was watching. Watching the little exchanges of glances, the unease in certain voices, the eagerness of others to deflect suspicion. She saw, too, the way Mrs. Denham kept her hands tightly clasped, her face pale but her eyes oddly dry. It was not grief alone that stiffened that woman's posture. It was something else, something unspoken. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, knew she would have to find out what it was. Chapter 4. Threads in the Maze. The following morning, Marlecombe awoke to a strange stillness. The fete tent still stood upon the vicarage lawn, though the cakes had been cleared away and the tables half collapsed. The maze, however, was now cordoned off with a length of rope and a sign that read police investigation. Do not enter. Children, of course, clustered nearby, daring one another to slip inside, until mothers dragged them off with stern warnings. The villagers had not ceased talking since the discovery. At the post office, in the grocer's, outside the church gates, the name of Henry Denham was on every tongue. Miss Marple, walking quietly along the lane with her market basket, heard enough to fill several notebooks had she wished to keep them. He had enemies, plenty of them. Never did trust his business dealings. It's his poor wife I pity, though some say she'll come into a tidy sum now. At the grocer's, she overheard something that pricked her interest. Mrs. Weatherby, the farmer's wife, lowered her voice as she leaned across the counter. I saw him, you know. Not long before he fell. He was arguing with young Mr. Ashcombe, looked fit to burst, the pair of them. Something about money, I shouldn't wonder. Now, Mrs. Weatherby, said Mr. Groves, the grocer, with a nervous glance toward Miss Marple. Best not to spread tales before the police finish their work. But Miss Marple, her expression mild, tucked that little morsel away. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the vicarage, where Inspector Graves was conducting interviews. The inspector, though earnest, had not yet mastered the art of listening beyond words. He scribbled in his notebook, nodded gravely, and pressed for facts, dates, times, exact words. But villagers rarely gave such neat answers. Miss Marple was permitted to sit quietly in the corner, ostensibly to keep Mrs. Pritchard company with her knitting. Graves did not yet realize that the elderly lady, with her gentle manner and seemingly random comments, was observing far more than he. 3 things caught her attention. The paper cup. Inspector Graves had found it near the body. Lemonade, slightly sticky at the bottom. He dismissed it as rubbish. But Miss Marple wondered, why was it so near the outstretched hand? The notebook, Mr. Denham's pocketbook, was missing. Several villagers swore they had seen him writing in it earlier that day. Had it been taken? And if so, by whom? The widow's composure, Mrs. Denham, pale but dry-eyed, repeated her statement without wavering. Her husband had left aside to take some air in the maze. She insisted she knew nothing of his last conversations. Yet her hands twisted her handkerchief until the lace nearly tore. Miss Marple said very little. She simply noted these threads, like the beginnings of a pattern in her knitting. And she thought, as she looked out the vicarage window toward the maze's green walls, crimes, like people, seldom appear as they truly are at first glance. Chapter 5. The Obvious Suspect. Inspector Graves had the look of a man who believed he was on the verge of solving a puzzle. He straightened his jacket, tapped his notebook with his pencil, and announced to the vicar and the gathered villagers that he was pursuing a promising lead. The lead, as it turned out, was Mr. Julian Ashcombe, a young solicitor's clerk with an untidy mop of hair and an unfortunate reputation for hot temper. He had been seen arguing with Henry Denham on the very morning of the fete, his voice raised so loudly that several villagers had turned their heads in disapproval. By mid-afternoon, word had spread, the constable had his man. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett declared it was no more than one would expect from a young man of his manners. At the bakery, Mr. Groves shook his head gravely and muttered, "Tragedy always starts with money." Even the Reverend Pritchard, usually reluctant to judge, admitted that Julian Ashcombe had been overly heated in his quarrels. Only Miss Marple remained silent. She had seen Julian Ashcombe once or twice before, a young man with earnest eyes, often hurrying about his errands with papers tucked under his arm. Hot-tempered, yes, but not, she thought, cruel. And though it was entirely possible he had shouted at Henry Denham in public, Miss Marple knew well that shouting and killing were 2 very different things. The inspector pressed on with his questioning. "You admit you quarrelled with Mr. Denham?" "I did," said Ashcombe, his chin lifted defiantly. "And you admit it was over money owed?" "Yes. He promised funds for my mother's mortgage and then refused. He mocked me, called me foolish for believing him." "And you followed him into the maze?" "No." Ashcombe flushed. "I left at once. I wouldn't. I didn't." The inspector closed his notebook with an air of finality. "You had motive, and you had opportunity. Until further notice, Mr. Ashcombe, you'll remain under suspicion." There was a murmur from the villagers who had crept close to the vicarage lawn to listen. The case, it seemed, was as good as solved. But Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her chair, kept her gaze on the young man's hands. They trembled slightly, not with guilt, she thought, but with frustrated innocence. She also recalled, with precise clarity, that the paper cup found near Henry Denham's body had been stamped with a faint smear of lipstick, hardly likely to have come from a young man like Ashcombe. No, she thought. The inspector was being led along the most obvious path, the one any inexperienced eye would follow. But in her long years of observing human nature, Miss Marple knew that guilt often lay not in the loudest quarrel, but in the quietest corner. She folded her knitting neatly into her bag and rose to leave. There were other questions to be asked, other observations to be made. And she, not the inspector, would be the one to find them. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The arrest of Julian Ashcombe sent ripples through Marlecombe, but instead of quieting the village, it only stirred deeper currents. Where suspicion begins, secrets are never far behind. At the post office the next morning, Mrs. Bartlett leaned across the counter with her usual relish. You may say what you like, but I know for a fact Henry Denham had more than one enemy. You've only to ask about that business with the Blackwood land. Mr. Groves raised his brows. Blackwood land? Oh yes. He all but tricked old Mr. Blackwood into signing it over. Promised improvements, then left the poor man destitute. And as for his niece, what's her name? Clara. Well, she hasn't spoken to him in years. Cut her out of the will, they say. Miss Marple, who had come in to buy a packet of tea, made no comment. She tucked the information away as she always did, piecing it carefully into the pattern forming in her mind. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Denham. The widow received her in the drawing-room of Marlecombe House, where heavy curtains dimmed the light and the air smelled faintly of lavender polish. Mrs. Denham was pale, her figure stiff in black, though the mourning was hastily arranged. She greeted Miss Marple politely but without warmth. You must forgive the disorder, she said, her hands smoothing her skirt unnecessarily. The police have been most thorough. Papers examined, drawers opened. It has all been very trying. Miss Marple's gaze wandered across the room, to the writing desk, where a drawer stood slightly ajar, to the mantel, where a photograph of Henry Denham had been turned face down, to the silver tray that held a decanter and two small glasses, one with a faint ring at the bottom. You must find it a great shock, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Denham's lips tightened. A shock, yes. But you will forgive me if I do not feign heartbreak. Henry was not an easy man, Miss Marple. He controlled everything. My friends, my spending, even my correspondence. Perhaps it is wicked to say, but I am not entirely bereft. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression kind. She had long ago learned that grief takes many forms, and sometimes its absence speaks loudest. Later that week, another whisper reached her ears. At the edge of the churchyard, she overheard two farmhands speaking in low tones. Swore he'd expose it, he did. Expose what? The vicar knows, I reckon. Some business about an affair. Denham wasn't above threatening people, you know. Miss Marple walked on, her step measured. Already she saw the outlines of what Inspector Graves could not, a web of grudges and hidden lives, each thread taut with motive. Julian Ashcombe might have quarrelled in public, but in the quiet corners of Marlecombe other, darker reasons for murder were beginning to surface. And Miss Marple, with her gentle manner and sharp mind, was ready to listen to them all. Chapter 7. A Second Shock. For a brief moment, Marlecombe settled into the uneasy rhythm of a village touched by tragedy. The fate was spoken of in hushed tones, children were warned away from the maze, and Julian Ashcombe's name hovered on every lip. Inspector Graves seemed confident enough that his case was building toward a conclusion. But then, late on Thursday evening, another cry shattered the fragile calm. It was Mrs. Bartlett, of all people, who discovered it. She had gone to return a borrowed dish to Mrs. Weatherby, and, taking the shortcut past the maze, she stumbled upon something dreadful, a handbag flung carelessly at the entrance, and beside it, a body. Within an hour, the news swept the village. Clara Denham, Henry's estranged niece, had been found dead. The villagers gathered once more near the maze, the constable struggling to keep them back. Clara lay upon the gravel, her fair hair disordered, her face turned toward the hedges. There were no outward wounds, no sign of struggle, only a strange, unnatural stillness about her. Inspector Graves, harried and pale, announced to the small crowd, "This appears to be poison. We shall know more when the doctor completes his examination." Poison. The word carried swiftly, repeated in whispers until it seemed to hang in the night air. First Henry Denham in the maze, now Clara Denham at its entrance. Coincidence was unthinkable. Miss Marple, who had been summoned by Mrs. Pritchard, stood quietly apart. Her eyes rested on the scene, but her mind worked beyond it. Clara Denham, young, impulsive, with a reputation for defiance. She had quarreled bitterly with her uncle over inheritance, and she had sworn never to forgive him. And yet, in death, she was drawn back into his shadow, laid low at the very threshold of the maze. Miss Marple bent to pick up the discarded handbag. Inside were a few coins, a folded letter. She handed it carefully to Inspector Graves, but not before noting the faint scent of bitter almonds clinging to the lining. The inspector was quick to seize on the simplest explanation. Clearly, he said, the girl sought to avenge her uncle's death. Perhaps she knew too much, or took her own life in despair. The villagers murmured agreement, relieved to have some theory, however flimsy. But Miss Marple's brow furrowed. 2 deaths, both bound to the maze. 2 deaths within days, both connected to the Denham family. And yet the inspector's tidy theory rang hollow. Suicide did not fit with the carefully folded letter, the neatly packed handbag. As the crowd dispersed under the watchful eyes of the constable, Miss Marple lingered. She looked at the dark outline of the hedges, their paths twisting invisibly within. The maze had claimed a second victim. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that it would not give up its secret easily. Chapter 8. Miss Marple Sets Her Traps. The second death had altered the mood of Marlacombe entirely. Where once there had been gossip and excitement, now there was unease, a shivering distrust that seemed to creep along the lanes and into the cottages. 2 deaths, both tied to the Denham name, both linked to the maze. The villagers no longer whispered openly but spoke in cautious tones, as if fearful the hedges themselves might overhear. Children were forbidden to play near the grounds. Mrs. Bartlett, once so eager to linger and speculate, now hurried past with her head down. Miss Marple, however, grew more purposeful. She knew well that truth seldom emerged from blunt questioning. People lied, or shaded their answers, or told the tale they wished others to believe. But people also betrayed themselves in small ways, in their glances, their hesitations, their careless words. If one knew where to look, the truth would show itself like a thread pulled loose from a tapestry. And so she began her quiet work. First, she visited Mrs. Denham. The widow was dressed immaculately in mourning black, but her eyes flickered nervously when Clara's name was mentioned. Miss Marple remarked gently, "How very strange that your niece should return to Marlacombe just now." Mrs. Denham pressed her lips together. Strange indeed. Clara was always willful. I cannot think why she came. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted her handkerchief until it nearly tore. Miss Marple noticed, and tucked the reaction away. Next, she called upon young Julian Ashcombe, who was now under unofficial watch by Inspector Graves. He was pale with indignation, but when Miss Marple spoke to him of Clara, his expression softened unexpectedly. "She didn't deserve this," he muttered. "She was headstrong, yes, but clever. She said she had proof about her uncle's dealings. She never showed me what it was. Now it's lost." "Proof, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Julian flushed, realizing he had said too much. But Miss Marple simply nodded, as if the remark were of no consequence, and rose to take her leave. Her third call was to Dr. Harrison, who had examined both bodies. Over a cup of weak tea in his surgery, she inquired about the cause of death. "Poison, without doubt," he said, lowering his voice. "Cyanide, in both cases. Bitter almonds, unmistakable. But how it was given, that I cannot say. Denham had been drinking lemonade. As for Clara, well, something she consumed that evening. The coroner will know more." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, her eyes thoughtful. Cyanide, swift, decisive, unmistakable. And both deaths tied to the fate. That evening, at the vicarage, she set her first subtle test. Over tea and seed cake, she spoke casually of Henry Denham's missing notebook. She mentioned it as though it were a trifle, something of little importance. The responses told her more than words ever could. Mrs. Pritchard frowned vaguely, uninterested. The Reverend murmured that he had not noticed it. But Mrs. Bartlett, who had dropped in uninvited, gave a start, so slight that most would have missed it, and spilled a few crumbs upon her lap. Miss Marple's eyes, hidden beneath her spectacles, twinkled. The maze might be full of twists and turns, but human nature, in her long experience, was far simpler. All she needed was patience, and a little gentle prompting, and the truth would step into the open of its own accord. Chapter 9. The Net Tightens. Inspector Graves, flushed with determination, had doubled his efforts since Clara Denham's death. He now saw the case as a race, secure enough evidence against Julian Ashcombe, and the matter would be settled. But the harder he pressed, the more uncertain the case became. Witnesses contradicted one another. Timelines blurred. The inspector grew testy, while the villagers, once eager to chatter, now chose their words with care. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved through Marlecombe with her usual unhurried step, her knitting bag over her arm, her manner mild and friendly. Yet behind her spectacles, her eyes missed nothing. She noticed that Mrs. Denham kept her curtains drawn tight, even in the daytime, though the weather was bright. She noticed that Dr. Harrison, usually brisk, had grown distracted, fumbling his prescriptions. She noticed that Mrs. Bartlett, though outwardly indignant at every twist of the investigation, grew more flustered whenever the missing notebook was mentioned. And then, one evening, a curious discovery was made. It was young Tommy Weatherby, sent to fetch a ball that had rolled behind the church shed. He returned not with the ball, but with a small brown envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, smudged with ink, a page torn from Henry Denham's notebook. On it were jottings, numbers, initials, and one cryptic line. C knows too much. Must act before it spreads. The paper was brought at once to Inspector Graves, who triumphantly waved it in the air before a cluster of villagers. Proof enough, he declared. Denham knew his niece was a danger to him. Clearly she sought to strike first, and her plan misfired. The crowd murmured agreement, but Miss Marple sat quietly at the edge of the gathering, her needles clicking softly. To her mind, the note proved something quite different. Henry Denham had indeed feared Clara, but if Clara was now dead, someone else must have feared her too. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window in the vicarage guest room, the moonlight falling across her work-basket. She thought of Henry Denham's enemies, too many to count. She thought of Clara's vow of proof, now silenced. She thought of the lemonade cup, the bitter almond scent, the missing pages of the notebook. The threads were beginning to knot together, though the pattern was not yet clear. And then, as if to complicate matters further, another whisper reached her ear the next morning. A stranger had been seen in Marlecombe. A tall man in a dark coat, loitering near the station, asking questions about the Denhams. The maze, it seemed, was not finished with its secrets. Chapter 10. The Stranger in the Village. Strangers seldom passed unnoticed in Marlecombe. The village was small, its rhythms well known, its faces familiar. So when a tall man in a dark coat was seen lingering near the railway station and later walking the lanes with an inquiring air, tongues began to wag at once. Mrs. Bartlett, of course, was the first to report him. Foreign-looking, she whispered to Mrs. Pritchard outside the grocer's. And with a notebook in his pocket. Always writing things down. That's never a good sign. Miss Marple, hearing this in passing, felt her interest stir. A notebook. The word echoed. She made no remark, but later that afternoon she set out along the lane by the station, her neat figure hardly noticed by the man who stood smoking near the hedge. He was not foreign at all, but unmistakably English, though with the weary air of one who had travelled often. His clothes were of good quality but somewhat worn, his manner brisk. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said pleasantly, pausing as though to admire the roses climbing the station wall. The man touched his hat. "Afternoon. I expect you are visiting friends?" she asked, her tone light and conversational. He hesitated, then said shortly, "Business." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. She had learned long ago that business could cover a multitude of sins. She did not press, but she watched. She saw the way his eyes flicked toward the manor house when he thought she was not looking, and the way he folded his notebook quickly as she turned to go. By the next morning, it was known. The man was Mr. Howard Cresswell, a clerk from a London law office. He had come, so he claimed, to make inquiries about Henry Denham's estate. But villagers muttered otherwise. Some said he was a creditor, others that he had been in Clara's confidence. Inspector Graves questioned him sternly in the vicarage. Mr. Cresswell remained calm, his answers precise. He admitted he had corresponded with Clara Denham before her death. She had written to him, hinting at irregularities in her uncle's business and promising to supply proof. "And where is this proof now?" the inspector demanded. "Lost, I fear," Cresswell said, his face grave. "Miss Denham intended to meet me here in Marlecombe. Instead," he spread his hands. The villagers, listening at the edges, were quick to leap to conclusions. Clara, they whispered, had been blackmailing her uncle. Or perhaps the stranger himself had silenced her. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire, said nothing. But inwardly, she considered carefully. Clara had indeed been on the trail of something that threatened not only Henry Denham but others as well. Her letter to this clerk confirmed it. And now, with Clara dead and the clerk sniffing about, whoever held the secret would be desperate to keep it buried. That evening, Miss Marple placed her knitting carefully on her lap and looked out at the hedges of the maze, darkening in the dusk. Secrets have a way of growing heavy, she thought. And sooner or later, someone will stumble under the weight of them. Chapter 11. Hidden Lives. The presence of Mr. Cresswell unsettled Marlacombe more than either of the deaths had done. A stranger in their midst seemed to draw out old fears, and with them, secrets that had been buried too long. Mrs. Bartlett whispered furiously to anyone who would listen that Clara Denham had been far too friendly with the London clerk. Mrs. Weatherby swore she had seen Clara slip letters into the post with an air of secrecy. And at the vicarage, the Reverend admitted, reluctantly, that he had once counselled Clara against rash attachments. Miss Marple listened to it all, her needles clicking softly. To the casual observer she seemed only half attentive, but she was carefully separating truth from embroidery, the way one might tease out a tangled skein of wool. The truth came, as it often did, from the least expected quarter. It was Mrs. Groves, the grocer's wife, who leaned across her counter one morning and said in a low voice, "If you ask me, it wasn't money at all. It was jealousy." Miss Marple raised her brows politely. Mrs. Denham, Mrs. Groves continued, with relish, wasn't blind to her husband's wanderings. He had an eye for the maids, always did. There was that business years ago with Elsie Turner, sent away in disgrace, poor girl. And lately, well, didn't you notice how often he lingered at the vicarage garden? Not for the roses, I'll wager. Miss Marple tucked this carefully into her memory. She had, in fact, noticed Henry Denham speaking often with Mrs. Pritchard in the days before the fete. Nothing improper, perhaps, but Mrs. Pritchard had blushed more than once beneath his gaze. Later that afternoon, she called upon Dr. Harrison with a small basket of scones, an excuse for conversation. The doctor was grateful, though distracted. "I had known Henry Denham for years," he admitted at last. "A difficult patient. Never took advice, always demanded exceptions. But, well, I must tell someone, there was something in his medical file. He suffered from a condition of the heart. Mild, but real. It would make his sudden death appear natural enough, you see. Convenient, even." "Very convenient," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes sharpening behind her spectacles. Piece by piece, the portrait of Henry Denham grew clearer, a man domineering in business, faithless in marriage, careless in health, and surrounded by those who had reason to hate him. Clara had threatened to expose him. Mrs. Denham had lived under his control. The villagers had been bruised by his dealings. And perhaps, even someone close to the vicarage had been entangled in his attentions. That evening, the maze loomed darker than ever in the twilight. Miss Marple stood a moment at its entrance, listening to the silence within. "2 deaths, and so many hands that might have struck the blow," she murmured. "But the truth, I think, is not scattered among them. It is gathered close, so very close." Chapter 12. A Shadow of Doubt. The village awoke to a stormy morning. Clouds pressed low over Marlacombe, and the air carried a restless unease. Rumour spread even more quickly than the rain, for Inspector Graves had made a decision. He was now convinced that Mrs. Denham herself was guilty. "It's clear enough," he declared at the inn. She suffered under his cruelty, she saw her niece about to betray them all, and she snapped. "Poison is a woman's weapon. We've no need to look further." The announcement caused a stir, and for a moment it seemed the inspector's argument had weight. Mrs. Denham, pale and reclusive, had indeed withdrawn behind shuttered windows. She refused visitors. Her husband had been harsh, her niece defiant, her life a web of humiliation. What more motive could one require? But Miss Marple sat very still at the vicarage breakfast table, her tea untouched. A faint frown puckered her brow. "It is a dangerous thing," she said softly, "to take the most obvious answer and press it to fit. One must be very sure before accusing a woman already broken." Events proved her right soon enough. That afternoon, as the storm broke with sudden violence, a cry rang out from the maze. Young Tommy Weatherby, drenched to the skin, came running to the vicarage door. "It's Mrs. Denham," he gasped. She's fallen, she's hurt. They found her at the heart of the maze, collapsed upon the damp gravel, her face grey, her breathing faint. At first it seemed another tragedy, but Dr. Harrison, summoned at once, shook his head. Not an attack, he said grimly. Exhaustion, and fear. Someone frightened her badly. When Mrs. Denham revived, she clung to Miss Marple's hand with desperate strength. Her words tumbled out in a whisper. It wasn't me. I never touched them. But I know. I know who did. Before she could say more, the doctor insisted she rest. She was carried back to the house, leaving the maze echoing with unanswered questions. That night, Miss Marple sat in her small guest room, the rain pattering at the window. The inspector had been eager to close the case, but now his certainty wavered. If Mrs. Denham was innocent, then suspicion must turn elsewhere. And yet, someone had tried to silence her. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She had seen such things before. When the truth draws too near, the guilty grow reckless. Soon, she murmured, they will show their hand. And when they do, we must be ready. Chapter 13. The Hidden Cache. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Marlecombe washed and glittering under a pale sun. Yet the air felt heavier than before. Villagers walked quickly, voices low, as though afraid to stir the secrets that pressed around them. It was Mr. Pritchard, the vicar, who made the discovery. He had gone into the maze with his pruning shears to cut back some of the storm-damaged branches. At a bend near the heart of the labyrinth, his shears struck not foliage but something hard beneath the soil. Curious, he dug with his hands until he unearthed a small tin box, rusted but intact. His face, normally mild, turned grave as he carried it at once to the vicarage study, where Inspector Graves and Miss Marple were conferring. Inside the box lay a bundle of letters tied with string, their paper spotted with damp but still legible. Miss Marple's thin fingers untied them carefully, smoothing each sheet. They were Henry Denham's correspondence, but not the kind expected of a respectable landowner. The letters revealed dealings in shady loans, hints of blackmail, and veiled threats to men of influence in London. Some bore initials, others only cryptic references. But the tone was unmistakable. Denham had been playing a dangerous game, profiting from the misfortunes of others. The last letter in the bundle was different. It was not written by Denham, but to him. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. If you do not destroy the evidence at once, I shall have no choice but to reveal all. Think carefully. For both our sakes. There was no signature. Inspector Graves let out a triumphant snort. There, you see. Proof enough that Clara, or Mrs. Denham, meant to blackmail him. It all fits. But Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. It does not fit at all. The writer speaks of both our sakes. That is the plea of an accomplice, not an enemy. Her words fell like a pebble into a still pond, sending ripples through the room. If Henry Denham had an accomplice, someone within the village who had profited by his schemes, then the motive for murder widened once again. That evening, as the villagers buzzed with news of the letters, Miss Marple walked alone to the maze. She stood where the tin had been buried, the soil still dark and fresh. The maze whispered with secrets. Two dead, one nearly silenced, and now these letters, a hidden history of betrayal. Quietly, Miss Marple touched the hedge with her fingertips. Yes, she murmured. We are closer now. And when the truth comes, it will strike very near indeed. Chapter 14. The Noose Tightens. The discovery of Henry Denham's hidden letters spread like wildfire through Marlecombe. By evening, the inn was abuzz with speculation. Every villager seemed certain that they alone knew the truth. Proof enough of Mrs. Denham's guilt, cried Mr. Bartlett over his pint. Who else could have written that letter? Who else stood to gain? But others shook their heads. Clara, it was Clara, insisted Mrs. Pritchard. She must have written it before she was silenced. The poor girl overreached herself. The tide of opinion swayed, but Inspector Graves, flushed with determination, fastened on a new suspect altogether, Dr. Harrison. He had access to medicines, the inspector declared, pacing the vicarage study. He knew of Denham's weak heart. He could have slipped poison into the lemonade with ease. And as for Clara, she threatened to expose him, perhaps. The man is nervous, distracted. It fits neatly enough. Dr. Harrison, when confronted, went pale with indignation. "I have dedicated my life to healing, not harm," he protested. "Yes, Denham was my patient, but I had no reason to kill him. And Clara, why, I tried to warn her to be cautious. I beg you, Inspector, do not make me out a villain." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, watched both men keenly. The inspector's certainty had grown brittle, while the doctor's distress seemed genuine. She had seen the signs before, of a man unjustly accused, and of the true culprit hidden in the shadows, tightening their hold. That night, danger struck again. Mrs. Bartlett, returning late from the inn, passed by the entrance to the maze. There she thought she saw a movement, a figure slipping within, silent as a shadow. Curiosity overcame caution. She followed. Within the twisting hedges, the air was damp and still. She took a few uncertain steps, then froze. Someone was there, someone waiting. A hand seized her wrist in the darkness, and she let out a sharp cry. At that very moment, lantern light flared. The vicar, out searching for his cat, had come to the maze. The figure vanished into the hedges, leaving Mrs. Bartlett trembling. "It was him," she gasped later to anyone who would listen. "Dr. Harrison, it must have been. I saw his coat, his shape. He meant to silence me." By morning, suspicion had hardened once again against the doctor. Graves spoke of warrants, of formal charges. But Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea at the vicarage, was more certain than ever. Dr. Harrison was not the guilty party. The killer was clever, yes, but also growing reckless. They had tried to frighten Mrs. Bartlett, just as they had Mrs. Denham. Too much haste, too much risk. Soon, she thought, the mask will slip. And when it does, the truth will be plain enough. Chapter 15. The Broken Chain. The morning after Mrs. Bartlett's fright dawned oddly still, as though the village itself held its breath. Marlecomb's lanes were damp with dew, the hedges glistening in the pale light. Few villagers stirred abroad. They spoke of shadows in the maze and of a killer bold enough to walk among them. Miss Marple, however, was already at work. She had asked the vicar's maid, young Alice, to fetch some of the fate decorations that still lay bundled in the church shed. It was there that Alice, rooting among the ribbons and lanterns, made a curious discovery. She carried it into the vicarage, her hands trembling, a gold pocket watch on a broken chain. Inspector Graves seized upon it at once. Inside the lid was engraved a set of initials, H.D. "Henry Denham's own watch," the inspector exclaimed. "And see here, the chain is snapped clean. Proof that it was torn away in a struggle. Why, this may have happened the very night of his death." The villagers nodded grimly, but Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. She noted the scratches upon the casing, the faint smudge of damp earth upon the chain. "This was not dropped carelessly," she murmured. "It was hidden." For the watch had been wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, as though to keep it safe from weather. Whoever had placed it in the shed had meant to return for it. By afternoon, another piece of the puzzle slipped into place. Old Mr. Jenkins, the gardener, recalled seeing Henry Denham near the shed on the morning of the fete, speaking sharply to someone out of sight. He could not be certain, but he thought it was a woman's voice that had answered. Miss Marple considered all this in silence, her needles clicking steadily. The broken watch, the hidden letters, the frightened women, it was all of a piece. Denham had quarrelled not only with his niece but with another woman entirely. That evening, as the sun set red behind the elms, she sat by the vicarage window, her face thoughtful. A pattern was emerging now, like a faint design in the fabric that only needed careful stitches to be revealed. The truth is very near, she thought. But we must be cautious. A cornered creature is always dangerous. Chapter 16. The Second Attempt. The discovery of Henry Denham's watch set the village churning once more. By evening, gossip was boiling over. Every tongue wagged with certainty. Mrs. Denham had hidden it, or Clara before her death, or perhaps the mysterious clerk, Mr. Cresswell. Suspicion lay everywhere, and trust was wearing thin. Miss Marple, however, was concerned less with theories than with patterns. She noted carefully who seemed most shaken by the news. Mrs. Bartlett grew shrill, Mr. Bartlett red-faced with denial, and Dr. Harrison grim with anger. But one villager, usually voluble, had fallen conspicuously silent. That night, as the vicarage grew quiet, Miss Marple found herself restless. She sat awake by her window, knitting idle in her lap, watching the moonlit hedges of the maze. Somewhere in that tangle, she felt, the truth was stirring. Her vigilance proved wise. Near midnight, a cry shattered the stillness. The sound came from the lane near the inn. Miss Marple, candle in hand, hurried down the stairs, where she found the vicar already at the door. Together they rushed out, joined by Inspector Graves, who had been dozing in a chair by the fire. There, by the roadside, they discovered Mr. Cresswell, the London clerk, dazed and bleeding from a blow to the head. His notebook lay scattered on the ground, pages torn. I was followed," he stammered. "Someone struck me from behind. They tried to take the letters Clara sent me. They knew I still had them." Inspector Graves swore under his breath. "Proof positive that the man knows too much," he growled. "This is a game of desperation now." Miss Marple bent to gather the fallen pages. Her fingers lingered on one in particular, a half-written draft of a letter Clara had begun. The words were faint but legible. "He will destroy us both if I do not speak. I am not afraid of him, but I fear for her." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, her mind whirring. Her. Clara had feared for another woman, someone close. Someone tied inextricably to Henry Denham's downfall. The attack on Cresswell had failed, but the message was clear. The killer was no longer content with silence. They were willing to strike openly now, and anyone who stood too close to the truth was in danger. As dawn broke pale across Marlacombe, Miss Marple stood at the vicarage gate, gazing toward the maze. The hedges gleamed wet with dew, their pathways winding and secretive. "The end is near," she murmured. "But we must tread carefully. The closer we come, the more dangerous it will be." Chapter 17. Threads of Truth. The attack on Mr. Cresswell cast a long shadow over Marlacombe. The villagers, already uneasy, now spoke in frightened whispers, locking their doors early and peering suspiciously at their neighbors. A killer, it seemed, walked freely among them, bold enough to strike twice, perhaps 3 times. Miss Marple, however, appeared as calm as ever, her small figure moving from cottage to cottage with her knitting bag over her arm. She listened, as she always did, to the scraps of conversation others dismissed as trivial. At Mrs. Groves's shop, she heard how Mrs. Bartlett had grown suddenly fearful of visitors, refusing callers at her door. At the inn, she caught a remark from young Tommy Weatherby, who swore he had seen Mrs. Denham burn a bundle of papers in her hearth late at night. And in the churchyard, she overheard 2 farmhands grumbling that Henry Denham had once cheated their families out of land, but that he hadn't done it alone. Piece by piece, Miss Marple wove these fragments together, her mind as busy as her hands with the needles. That evening, she sought out Mrs. Denham. The poor woman, still pale from her collapse, received her hesitantly. In the dim parlor, Miss Marple spoke gently, as one might to a frightened bird. "My dear," she said, "I know you are not guilty of these terrible acts, but you do know something you fear to say." Tears welled in Mrs. Denham's eyes. "He held me fast for so many years," she whispered. "Even now I hear his voice. But it wasn't only him. There was another, someone he trusted. Someone who shared in all of it. That is the person Clara meant to expose." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression remained kind. "And that person," she asked softly, "is still here in Marlacombe?" Mrs. Denham gave a small, despairing nod. When Miss Marple left the house, the dusk was falling, and the maze loomed dark against the sky. Her heart was heavy, for she had nearly all the pieces now. The accomplice, the motive, the silenced voices, it formed a grim pattern. But there was still one thread missing, one stitch to complete the design. Until she found it, the killer would remain free and dangerous. She paused at the maze gate, her eyes narrowing. Somewhere within those hedges lay not only the truth, but the key to proving it. Chapter 18. The Quiet Trap. Marlacombe held its breath. Days passed without another incident, yet the unease only deepened. Villagers walked the lanes quickly, avoiding the maze altogether. Curtains twitched at every footstep. It was as though the village itself sensed the truth was close, pressing against the walls of silence. Inspector Graves, restless and irritable, insisted he was on the verge of an arrest, though his suspects shifted by the hour. But Miss Marple, her manner calm and unhurried, had already begun to weave her net. She went about it so gently that no one noticed. A word here, a question there, always in her mild way, always with her knitting in hand. She asked Mrs. Bartlett about the Fates lemonade, and Mrs. Groves about the oilcloth kept in the shed. She inquired of young Alice which villagers had keys to the church, and of Tommy Weatherby what he saw that night in the maze. Each answer, small on its own, added another thread. And slowly, the design emerged. Meanwhile, the killer, though still hidden, began to falter. That night, a stone was thrown through the vicarage window, shattering glass across the study floor. A note lay wrapped around it, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Stop asking questions, or the next will be worse." Inspector Graves roared with indignation, but Miss Marple only picked up the note with delicate fingers, studying the uneven script. "Desperation," she said softly. "And desperation leads to mistakes." The very next day, the killer indeed overreached. It was Mrs. Bartlett again who stumbled too close. Returning from market, she swore she had seen someone rifling through Mr. Cresswell's belongings at the inn. She hurried to tell the vicar, but before she could reach his gate, a figure stepped from the hedge and barred her path. This time, however, she was not alone. Miss Marple, having anticipated the move, was walking just behind. At the sight of her, calm and unflinching, the would-be assailant faltered, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and vanished into the dusk. Mrs. Bartlett, breathless, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "You saved my life," she exclaimed. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, my dear. Only delayed matters. But soon, it will end. Quite soon." That night, in the quiet of her room, she laid aside her knitting and folded her hands. She knew who had killed Henry Denham, who had silenced Clara, who had struck at Cresswell. The pattern was whole at last. Now came the final task, to prove it before the killer struck again. Chapter 19, The Final Test. It was Miss Marple herself who proposed the gathering. She did it so gently, so reasonably, that even Inspector Graves agreed. "A meeting, dear Inspector," she said in her mildest tone, "at the vicarage. After all, we must bring this dreadful matter to a close. Let us have everyone who was near the fate that day present. It will clear the air." And so, on a cool evening, the vicarage drawing-room filled with tense faces. Mrs. Denham sat stiff and pale, her hands trembling in her lap. Mrs. Bartlett, eager for drama, perched forward with wide eyes. Dr. Harrison stood near the hearth, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Mr. Cresswell kept to a corner, his notebook clutched like a shield. Even the Bartletts, the Groveses, and a handful of villagers crowded in, whispering nervously. Inspector Graves presided with an air of authority, though his gaze slid often to Miss Marple, as though uncertain whether he led the proceedings or merely followed them. Miss Marple sat in her usual place, knitting needles clicking, her face serene. "My friends," she began softly, "we have lived in fear these past weeks. But I think the time has come for the truth. Not through further violence, nor suspicion, but simply by listening to what is already before us." She spoke of the lemonade cup, the missing notebook pages, the hidden letters in the tin, and the broken watch. One by one, she laid the fragments on the table like pieces of a patchwork quilt. The room grew silent as the pattern emerged. Henry Denham was not merely a difficult man, she said. He was a man engaged in ruthless dealings. And he did not act alone. Someone close to him, someone here in Marlacombe, was his accomplice. When Clara discovered this, she threatened exposure. That is why she was silenced. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Bartlett clutched her scarf. Dr. Harrison swore under his breath. Miss Marple's needles paused. She looked up, her eyes keen behind her spectacles. "I have thought long and hard about what kind of person would act so. Not one driven by sudden passion, nor by desperation alone, but one accustomed to deceit, to secrecy, to the steady profit of another's suffering. And such a person, when pressed, will reveal themselves, not by words, but by their fear." Her gaze swept the room slowly. "Therefore," she said gently, "let us consider something simple. Only the guilty party could have placed the letters in the tin at the maze. Only the guilty party would have known of Mr. Cresswell's correspondence and sought to steal it. And only the guilty party, when they hear a certain name, will betray themselves." She folded her hands. "Shall I say the name, Inspector?" The room seemed to hold its breath. All eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple's calm voice cut through the silence. "Yes, I think it is time." Chapter 20, The Name in the Room. The vicarage drawing-room seemed to tighten as Miss Marple's soft words faded. Every villager present leaned forward, waiting. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the panes. Inside, silence pressed like a weight. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her voice calm but steady. The person who killed Henry Denham, who silenced Clara, and who struck at Mr. Cresswell, was none other than Mrs. Bartlett. A shocked murmur swept the room. Mrs. Bartlett gave a strangled laugh. Me? Oh, really, Miss Marple. I may enjoy a little gossip, but murder? That is absurd. But Miss Marple did not flinch. On the contrary, my dear. Gossip was your weapon, and your shield. You talked so freely of everyone else's secrets that no one thought to question your own. But you were Henry Denham's partner. Those letters in the tin, many of them were written by you. It was your hand in the oilcloth, your careful concealment. Inspector Graves frowned. But the watch? Yes, Miss Marple nodded. Henry Denham discovered that Mrs. Bartlett had been keeping certain records of his dealings. He confronted her near the church shed that morning, which is why the gardener heard voices. There was a struggle, his chain broke. Later, Mrs. Bartlett hid the watch, intending to retrieve it when suspicion had passed. But the storm revealed her secret too soon. Mrs. Bartlett's face had drained of color. You can't prove. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, before she set them down. The proof is in Clara's unfinished letter. I fear for her, she wrote. Clara knew you were entangled in her uncle's crimes. She meant to expose you as much as him. That is why you had to silence her. That is why you tried to frighten Mrs. Denham, and later, to stop Mr. Cresswell. You feared the truth would come out. Inspector Graves rose to his feet, his face thunderous. Mrs. Bartlett, do you deny these charges? Mrs. Bartlett's lips trembled. Her eyes darted from face to face, but no sympathy met her there. Even her husband sat rigid, horror dawning in his eyes. At last, she gave a bitter laugh. Henry thought he could use me. I kept his accounts, I saw it all. Do you think I'd let Clara destroy us both? I did what was necessary. Gasps filled the room. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. But murder is never necessary, my dear. It only spreads ruin. And it always comes to light, sooner or later. The inspector stepped forward. That will do. Mrs. Bartlett, you'll come with me. As he spoke, the tension in the room broke like a storm at sea. Villagers whispered, Mrs. Denham wept softly, and Mr. Cresswell sat stunned, his notebook clutched in white-knuckled hands. Miss Marple quietly resumed her knitting. She did not look triumphant, only thoughtful, as though the crime were merely another sad story in the long tapestry of human folly.